This is my third attempt at making this video. It's a video that talks about a book that has changed the entire way that I think about my own species. This is a book that is incredibly important to me. It is a book that could, and I hope it does, go down as one of the great history books of the 21st century. It is a book that argues the case that we are actually good. And it's something that I, as a cynic, have struggled with. And it's something that has changed my entire life, as hyperbolic as that sounds. This video is a book review, but it's also an essay, and as an ex-teacher, it's also kind of a lesson. And most of all, urging you to pick up Humankind by Rutger Bregman. So I first met Rutger Bregman at a talk/book signing/Q&A about 3 years ago when he released his first book that was translated into English from his native Dutch, Utopia for Realists. This book was a manifesto on universal basic income, and it was a book that completely convinced me that universal basic income is good for our society, for our economy. It is something that would only make us happier and healthier on a personal, political, economic level. Now from here, Bregman has tackled something far, far larger than one specific economic and political factor. He has tackled all of human history from the perspective of goodness and kindness in the book Humankind. As you can see here, I have dog-eared this book from beginning to end because I don't have post-it notes, and every single one of these dog ears is a revelation. Every single one of these is a moment that changed my perspective and opened my eyes to the goodness of humanity. Throughout my 20s, I have read many history books, most of the most popular history, geography, and politics books by authors like Yuval Noah Harari, Jared Diamond, Richard Dawkins, Steven Pinker. All of these writers are mentioned in this book. All of them are cited as inspirations and people that Bregman actually questions, and whose views and narratives and research Bregman actually pulls apart and argues that there's far more to it. Let me back up. The general narrative about humanity is that we are harsh, that we are innately selfish, and that it is our selfishness that has allowed us to rise to the top of the food chain, to build cultures and civilizations, kingdoms, to create art and science. But ultimately, it's a negative thing, our selfishness. And we've been taught by the news media, by politicians, by authors and writers and thinkers for centuries that ultimately we are selfish. And this selfishness has created the world around us, but it's ultimately a very negative thing. Rutger Bregman says that this just simply isn't true. That at our very core, our nature, our heart, is one of goodness and kindness. Before I get into the details of the book, what I really want to make very clear here is that Rutger Bregman is an historian. He is also a man of great philosophy, politics, economics. He's a man of obscenely broad intelligence, and his greatest strength is research. Every argument put forth here has been meticulously researched. He travelled the world talking to people who have been ignored, whose studies have been overlooked, whose books didn't reach the high sales of things like The Selfish Gene and Sapiens and all of Jared Diamond's books. He cites Bertrand Russell as a great inspiration. Bertrand Russell was a British philosopher, author, mathematician, all-round genius, who believed first and foremost in objectivity, in not allowing our biases to cloud our judgment, and to always question everything, even if it seems to be the truth. Do not let the truth, or people's truth, get in the way of facts and what life really is. That's exactly what Bregman does here. He ignores the narratives by certain authors, thinkers, journalists, media, politicians. He ignores their truth, their narrative threads, their propaganda, and instead he favours facts and information that prove we are good and kind. So how does he do that? To start with, the book is separated into 5 parts with an introduction, 2 prologues, and an epilogue. In the introduction, Bregman tells a fantastic story about how during the Blitz, a lot of Londoners fought back against the bombings and the death with comedy and camaraderie. It was a moment of truth that showed that in situations where we panic and we are afraid, our selfishness does not win out. In fact, our kindness and our camaraderie is what wins out. Winston Churchill did not learn that lesson. And so the Brits assumed naively that this was a Britishism, that this was some aspect of British civilization, that we were funny and we were tough in the face of adversity. And so he responded by bombing a German city. And the residents of that city also laughed and also came together in a show of camaraderie. Because that is the truth of the human spirit. And from here, in the two prologues, he tackles the Lord of the Flies and the news. First is the news, and he points out the fact that news media has a duty unto itself, if you like, to spin frightening and dark narratives that make us tune in and build up a kind of hate within us that make us afraid and angry and, most of all, distrustful of our fellow man. It makes us more selfish by assuming other people are selfish, and that spins and it spins and it spins. And he argues that the media does this on purpose, and he gives a few examples. In the second prologue chapter, he talks about Lord of the Flies by William Golding, a book that I have studied, a book that I have taught in my high school teaching days, and a book that most of us internalize as truth. The Lord of the Flies is the truth of the human spirit. And he says, well, that just can't be true. So he picks apart William Golding's life and his own narrative and his own bias as an abusive alcoholic. And then he says, why do we rely on this man's piece of fiction as a symbol of what the human heart really looks like? Then he finds a real-life example of Lord of the Flies when a group of Australian schoolchildren in the 1960s stole a fishing boat, tried to make it to New Zealand, and ended up on an island where they built a perfect commune of peace and happiness. They lit a fire and kept the fire lit for 1.5 years, and they even built a badminton court. They lived a perfect Lord of the Flies civilization of prosperity on a tiny island commune where every morning they prayed and they created a life of structure and peace and harmony. For the main bulk of Humankind, Rutger Bregman looks at our prehistoric days as hunter-gatherer nomads, our current real-life world, and many, many, many historic examples of psychological studies and crimes and the lives of politicians, researchers, journalists, all sorts, to come to a conclusion that we are ultimately kind. What is perhaps most fascinating, or what was the biggest revelation for me at the beginning, was a study that 2 Russian scientists did about silver foxes in Siberia. They argued that we don't breed dogs based on their appearance, even though we think we do. The softest coats, the cutest eyes, the physical appearance of dogs is what we love so much. We want them to be as cute as possible, and so we've bred them to be cute and sweet and small and adorable. And these scientists argued that actually all of the physical traits that we consider cute and pretty and sweet are a byproduct of kindness. So these 2 Russian scientists spent 20 years breeding these silver foxes based on only their capacity for kindness. They took the kindest of a pack and bred them together, and then they took the kindest of those and bred them together, and they did this for 20 years. Based entirely on kindness, they found that these silver foxes started to exhibit dog-like traits. They wagged their tails, they barked, and they started to look smaller and cuter with softer coats, bigger eyes, etc., etc. Physical cuteness is a byproduct of kindness, and humanity did the exact same thing. Here he talks about Neanderthals. Neanderthals were another branch of humanity. They were another species of human who were wiped out. Most historians, even Yuval Noah Harari, a man that I absolutely adore, thought that we, Homo sapiens, wiped Neanderthals out, even though Neanderthals were bigger, stronger, and smarter. We didn't wipe them out. We were kinder, we worked together, we created tight-knit communities that supported one another. Neanderthals were not as kind, and they died out. It is our kindness that has allowed us to survive. For the rest of the book, Bregman deconstructs so many myths and lies about the nature of humanity. One of them is the Stanford Prison Experiment, a very, very famous psychological experiment about taking a group of students and dividing them into the prison guards and the prisoners. And he deconstructs it, and he uses research and talks to people and pores over information that he has to find out that the experiment not only was a lie, but has already been debunked, and that debunking has been ignored before because people prefer narratives that cast us in a dark and horrible light. It's more exciting. The truth is already there, it has already been published, and Bregman is just pointing that out. Bregman cites the murder of Kitty Genovese, a woman who in the Bronx in New York City in the 1960s was murdered, and 38 people looked on and did nothing from their bedroom windows. This also turned out to be a lie, spun by the New York Times and various other news sources and journalists. I think he mentions that one journalist even had the truth and wasn't allowed to publish it because it wasn't as exciting. The truth is that many, many people did do something. In fact, Kitty Genovese died in her friend's arms. I think it was in a stairwell. She didn't die alone in the alleyway, as many people have reported. It's very easy to find the truth if you're good at researching, as Bregman is. Something that Bregman really dwells on is the fact that prehistoric, pre-civilization man was very, very kind and peaceful. That we were perfectly lovely people until we started building civilizations, and civilizations led to the concept of wealth and the concept of land ownership and hierarchies. And it is a bit of a mystery as to why these things happened. And so Bregman actually goes into that in a lot of detail, and I won't cover everything here because I could just regurgitate this whole book to you and how it changed me and how it could change you. But again, I urge you to read it. The idea that we gave up perfect communes of nomadic peacefulness to create land ownership and money and hierarchies and kings and religions and all of these things that have corrupted us. And it's very interesting as to why this happened. And he also argues that just because that happened, it doesn't mean that we are suddenly any less than kind. We as a species are still good and kind. And it is the people at the top who are unkind, and it is the media that is unkind. These are the two things that he remains cynical about. CEOs, but not all of them. Politicians, but not all of them. And journalists, but not all of them. These three groups are the ones that spin the narratives of unkindness and are actually the ones that perpetrate this unkindness most of all, whereas the average person does not. A very, very important thing that he mentions, and I was thinking it before he got to it, and most people will when they're reading this, is Auschwitz. If people are good and kind, explain Auschwitz. And instead of explaining Auschwitz, what he does is explain multiple things that led to Auschwitz, such as the concept of Nazism, propaganda, and the distance that people have from the atrocities that they create. So he cites the fact that actually at war on the battlefield, most people don't fire their guns because they don't want to kill. And during the American Civil War, a lot of the muskets, I think it's muskets, I'm not big on guns, you load them with one pellet and then you fire it. And a lot of these guns actually have multiple pellets shoved into them because it turns out that loading your gun is a great excuse for not firing your gun. They wanted to look busy on the battlefield, so they just kept reloading because they didn't want to kill anyone. And this has been proven again and again on battlefields throughout history. People don't like killing. And so when they're out on the battlefield, they do everything they can to avoid firing their guns. When it comes to Nazism, he talks about brotherhood and how so many terrorists and so many bad people in the world, and you can turn to the incels and white supremacists of today for more proof of this, is that quite often there are brotherhoods, there are cults. We love camaraderie, which in itself is a good thing, but these things can be twisted and spun to create atrocities. And in fact, Nazism, the philosophy of Nazism, started further back. At the front lines, what the soldiers enjoyed most was the camaraderie that fighting for a cause gave them. So again, this community, this brotherhood, whatever you want to call it, is an ultimately good thing that gets respun and twisted and manipulated to have bad things happen. So you've got a group of good people who believe that they are fighting together, they enjoy their community, they enjoy their brotherhood, but there's this one person at the top who is telling them what to do, giving them that camaraderie, which is ultimately doing bad. As you can see, this book has affected me in a very, very deep and meaningful way. This is the third time I've tried to make this video, and every one of these 3 attempts has been full of different information from Humankind. Things that I'm desperate to talk about, things that I get annoyed that I miss out, and so I refilmed the whole video. And I'm going to watch over this and be annoyed at the things that I've missed. But there is so much here. There is so much goodness and kindness and sweetness and positivity in this book. But none of it is wishy-washy fairy tale nonsense. None of it is twee and silly. This is science, this is history, this is politics, this is facts and information. This is real life. This is a real life book about real people. This is fact. This is truth. This is a real narrative that pushes aside the media and the politicians and the CEOs who tell us over and over again information that we regurgitate about selfishness and hatred and how we're ultimately bad. He tears apart the philosophies of people like Jared Diamond and the books written by Richard Dawkins and Steven Pinker. Steven Pinker wrote The Better Angels of Our Nature, a book that I absolutely adored because it taught me that we were bad at the beginning and our society has allowed us to be better and better. And Rutger Bregman says no, much of that is not true. That in fact we were actually better to begin with and society has made us worse. If I can fit in one final thing, I want to mention this. The entire book is hinged on the relationship between two philosophers, Thomas Hobbes and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Hobbes believed that we are ultimately bad and it is our civilization that allows us to be good. Rousseau believed that we were ultimately good at heart and civilization is what corrupts us. And throughout the book, Bregman tries to remain objective and clear, but it ultimately comes out that Rousseau had it right, that we are ultimately good and kind and we are corrupted by minor things with great power. And it is such an uplifting philosophy. And it's not just a philosophy, it is something that is proven through history, economics, politics, mathematics, science, over and over again throughout this book. This book has the power to change the way that you see your fellow man. It allows you to be a humanist, a good and kind person who trusts other people. And if we were all to read and believe and trust in this book and what it has to offer, we could achieve so much more goodness and kindness. But again, Bregman would probably say we already do. I'm beginning to sound like a cult leader. I'm beginning to sound like one of those people who thinks Jordan Peterson has all the answers. But the fact is, I don't know how else to communicate my excitement and my joy at reading a book like this. Humankind has given me so much to love and so much to believe in. All of it supported by history and science and decent research. Please read this book. Don't let it be forgotten. Don't let the lessons in this book be forgotten. They can teach us so much good.